All right, Paleo Hackers, welcome back. With me today on the other end is Jennifer McGrother, rhymes with brother. Just got that out of the way. She runs the Nourish Kitchen, the Farm to Table book and blog, and she focuses on farm to table. Her Facebook's got over 500,000 likes. Jennifer, you're very popular on Facebook, and welcome to the call.
Thank you so much for having me, Clark. I really appreciate being here.
Yeah, that was awesome. So I'm just curious, like that's a big number for this sphere, is 500,000. How did that come to be?
It's all very organic. I think that when you share good information with people, they tend to share it and they engage better with the page. And so it just grew and grew and grew organically as more and more people began to become engaged with conversations that were taking place. I share a lot about the microbiome, fermentation. So it's not all about Nourish Kitchen. It's definitely about the entire sphere of information that's available out there.
Okay. And so on the Nourish Kitchen then, whether it be on Facebook or the blog, what kind of approach are you taking to health, wellness, nutrition? What information are you sharing?
I come from a Weston Price background and am definitely a traditional foods enthusiast. However, I think that information has a lot of crossover for many people in the broader community. About 30% of the readers at Nourish Kitchen adhere to like a paleo or primal diet, and about 10% are vegan or vegetarian. So there's definitely crossover within that sphere, but I definitely come at it from a Weston A. Price perspective. Lots of emphasis on bone broths, farm to table, heirloom vegetables, and traditional methods of preparing and cooking foods.
Okay. And so how did you start with the Weston A. Price background? Like, were you just reading the books?
It was an accident, really. Somebody turned me on to an old forum that's now more or less defunct about natural family living and mothering. And on that forum, there was a recommendation to make your own yogurt. And I thought, wow, you can make your own yogurt. I had no idea, right? And so we were so that turned me on to traditional foods, Weston A. Price. And I was coming at it from being a very, very, very sick vegan. And I found Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, Dr. Price's book, and I read that at the same time that I read, I think, Diet for a New America, which has very contrasting ideas. And I found that the work of Dr. Price really resonated with me, and it was fascinating.
Okay, so Weston A. Price, he was a dentist, correct?
Yeah, Dr. Price was a dentist. He lived in Cleveland in the early 20th century, and he found that in his practice, many of the children that he were seeing were experiencing malformations of the palate, dental decay, and he was wondering why future generations, this younger generation, was getting sicker and sicker. And he chose to travel the entire world and really analyze the diets of people who did not have access to industrial modernized foods. And he found some really striking differences between traditional diets and modern diets, and striking differences between the traditional diets of people all across the globe, as well as similarities too.
Okay.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and with the teeth, one thing that I was reading about Weston A. Price is that it's actually like a skeletal deformation when you have the teeth all misaligned. And so, being a dentist, of course, that's his area of focus. And so he's looking at these indigenous tribes or modern people and realizes that their teeth are deformed. And that's a big, okay, what's going on here? And I mean, of course, like I had jacked up teeth. I still have jacked up teeth because I got braces and didn't wear my retainers. So, it gets passed. But when you trace it back, teeth are pretty much perfect.
Yeah, it's fascinating. When you look at his images, the images he took while he was traveling, you find that even though these people who adhere to their traditional diets didn't have access to things like modern dentistry, they certainly didn't have access to braces and orthodontics. They didn't even have access to toothbrushes, yet their teeth were in perfect condition, perfectly aligned, very little cavities. And so he began to really analyze those differences between their diets and modern diets. And he found that their diets were higher in things like fat-soluble vitamins, that's A, D, E, K2, and lower and higher in things like phosphorus and various minerals. And, it is a skeletal malformation. And a lot of that begins during pregnancy. It's related to maternal intake of vitamins and minerals. And then, of course, that's largely formed by the time children are in their toddler years. And so that early nutrition for mothers and expectant mothers and fathers who want to have children too, as well as nutrition for small children, can really make a big difference in health in the long run.
Okay. So with the Weston A. Price approach and the Nourished Kitchen, I mean, you're bringing in things like you mentioned with bone broths and fermented foods. I know one of them is grains. They do, Is it fermented grains, or how do they prepare grains?
In the Weston Price tradition, when you consume grains, they're consumed soaked, soured, or sprouted. So there's three ways. And the reason why we do that is because grains, as I'm sure your listeners are fully aware, contain anti-nutrients like food phytate. Now, food phytate can bind up minerals and prevent their full absorption. But when you undertake these traditional preparation methods like sourdough leavening or sprouting or soaking overnight in like an acidic solution, you activate enzymes. And those enzymes, food phytase, deactivate the anti-nutrients that can bind up the minerals. So for people who tolerate grains well, it's important to consume them in a way that they have been traditionally prepared, soaked, soured, or sprouted.
When you soak, sour, sprout them, that gets rid of the anti-nutrients in there?
It helps to mitigate the presence of the anti-nutrient food phytate. So, and it does that by activating enzymes that deactivate that anti-nutrient. So it's pretty interesting. Okay. Cooking them also helps to minimize anti-nutrients. It doesn't get rid of it completely, but it helps. So
it's different than just eating bread. The way you prepare grains is very different.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is that sourdough leavening in particularly is very beneficial. So, for example, just as we see increased B vitamin production in other fermented foods, kombucha, sauerkraut, kimchi, kefir, yogurt, we see increased B vitamins. So too do we see that with grains that have been traditionally prepared through sourdough leavening. So sourdough bread, because of the lactic acid producing bacteria, is actually higher in folate. Folate, of course, is a nutrient. It's a B vitamin that's critical for women of childbearing age for its ability to prevent neural tube defects. So sourdough bread is actually richer in B vitamins like folate. And then, of course, those bacteria, those lactic acid producing bacteria, they eat up carbohydrates. And as a result, they produce lactic acid. That's what gives sourdough bread its characteristic tartness. But it also reduces the glycemic load of that bread. So people who are consuming whole grain sourdough bread are eating a bread that is richer in B vitamins and richer and lower on the glycemic index than, say, a regular.
Right. Because I imagine the person listening to this who doesn't eat grains, and one of the arguments out there, especially when eliminating gluten or whatever, is that grains aren't as beneficial to you and they don't really provide that much nutrition. But what you're saying maybe is with soaking, sprouting, or fermenting them, that they can provide some beneficial nutrition in a substantial amount.
I think that they can definitely provide some beneficial nutrition. Not everybody can tolerate. Certainly not everybody tolerates gluten, and not everybody tolerates grains in general.
Is the gluten still in it when you do this fermentation process? Oh, it is? Okay.
It is. Now, keep in mind that there's some research out of Italy, some preliminary research that has looked into sourdough fermentation and its effects on gluten. And their preliminary research, keep in mind it is preliminary, their research indicates that very, very long fermentation times in sourdough may help to deactivate the gluten toxicity for some individuals. with celiac disease. I don't think that that's carte blanche to go out and eat sourdough bread if you have gluten intolerance or celiac disease, but it is promising. And that research needs to continue. So I think that in general, if you're happy on a grain-free diet and you feel that that's really beneficial for you and working for you, you should stick with it. But if you choose to consume grains, I think it's important that you choose to consume them in a way that honors how they've been traditionally prepared, because we see grains and grain consumption going back, thousands and thousands and thousands of years. It's fascinating.
The counter argument, if I was devil's advocate, would be that it's mutated, and that like Dr. O'Brien was on the show and he said the 50-50 rule, within the last 50 years, the gluten percentage has gone up to over 50% bigger. So now we don't have these like little gluten particles. We got the big ones, and that's going to cause leaky gut and inflammation and higher risks of all that. So that is
absolutely concerning. And certainly I think that we should be concerned about what's happening to our food in general. And grains are a great example about how we have hybridized them so that they bear very little resemblance to what they originally were. So this is why I think many people who tolerate grains should probably opt for something like einkorn, which is the first wheat that was domesticated and used by the early Spanish. It's like the first wheat, and then there's emmer and spelt. There's also options like heritage wheats, those wheats that were brought to the United States, for example, with the first pioneers and the first colonists. And you can and those have not been hybridized to the extent of our super modern wheat that came about during the Green Revolution. So you have things like white Sonoran, which came over with the Spanish. You have Turkey Red. You have Red Fife. And so there are many heritage wheats that are not going to have quite that striking issue that modern wheat that you find in the grocery store does.
Yeah, so we can minimize some of the issues. So this isn't the stuff like you see on the shelves normally, like Dave's Killer Bread or anything like that. This is a specific kind of process.
Right. It's super traditional, and that's what, and I love really looking into traditional practices, traditional and heritage breeds and heirloom varieties, and I think that they can provide us a lot of benefit. We tend to eat a lot of the same foods over and over and over again, and I think that is just a general issue with the American diet. Wheat, of course, is definitely a culprit.
Yeah. Didn't the Dave's Killer Bread guy go back to prison? I heard something in the news that he did, because that was his thing. Is like, he was in prison, then he got out and he made his bread. And I read somewhere recently within the last month or whatever, it's got the big tattoo arm flexing on the front, and it's in like all the Whole Foods, and that guy. And that was his whole shtick. And I think I don't know. I mean, I got to look that up. I'll try and do that, but.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that.
Yeah.
I usually make my own. So.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so, being traditionally prepared with grains, let's talk about bone broths real quick. Kind of set it up. Walk us through like bone broth 101.
Okay, so if you can boil water, you can make bone broth. And it's crazy because it's going for like $14, $15 a quart, and it's something that you can make at home for pennies.
Yeah. Farmers market selling it for expensive stuff.
Oh my gosh, it's crazy. Yeah. I've been known to buy it on occasion in a pinch. But so what you do is you take your bones. Now, if you are working with a chicken, you're going to roast that chicken first, and you want to use roasted bones if at all possible. And the reason for that is that it increases the depth of flavor in your bone broth. So basically, you take like the spent bones of a roasted chicken or a roasted turkey, put them into a stock pot. Now, to this, you're going to want to add something slightly acidic. Now, many people use apple cider vinegar because, one person started using apple cider vinegar and then everybody puts it in their bone broth. But you can use other acids like wine. White wine is wonderful with chicken bones. Cover it with water. Now, here is where things start to differ. You can also add, in traditional stock making, you add vegetable matter to the bone broth. So you might add mirepoix, which is carrots, onions, and celery. You can have bay leaves and peppercorns, or you can just leave it plain bones and wine or vinegar. And I usually keep it as plain as possible. And the reason I do that is because I like to flavor my end dish how I want it to be flavored. And so I don't want the flavors introduced into a bone broth to carry over into the end dish. So if I'm making French food, it might be very, very different from, using the same bone broth in Thai cooking or Indian cooking. So it's bones, water, and some sort of acid. Okay. And you boil it basically until the bones can crumble. And that's kind of what differentiates a stock from a bone broth. Stocks are typically, they're essentially comprised of the same thing, bone, water, except that they are cooked for a smaller amount of time. Bone broths, when people make them at home, usually cook them until the bones can be, pinched or soft enough to be pinched between the thumb or forefinger. At that point, you strain off the broth, you stick it in the fridge, and overnight, the fat will separate from the liquid. And you can pull off that fat, and you can use it to roast vegetables or something like that, or you can discard it.
What do you do with the bones, since they're crumbly? Do they get in the broth and you drink them, or do you throw them out?
Some people will use an immersion blender and create kind of like a gravy with the crumbled bones.
And you can do that? That's okay to eat?
You can totally do that. You can eat those bones that way. That doesn't appeal to me in a culinary sense.
Yeah.
But certainly in terms of nourishment, those bones are still going to have quite a few minerals. You don't extract all of the minerals from the bones. In fact, bone broth is particularly rich in protein, and it has a moderate to small amount of minerals. So you're really after the protein. And the protein that's in bone broth is it's gelatin. Mm-hmm. And gelatin is really good for the digestive tract. It's really good for the joints and the skin. And it's a great source of protein in the sense that it's a protein sparer. So it helps you to get more protein out of the other foods that you consume.
I've seen those in supplements, like a little powder or whatever, like the gelatin powder.
Oh, sure. And so you see a lot of like collagen peptides are taken as a supplement for a lot of people. They'll put it into their morning coffee.
Right. Does it have a taste? Is it salty? Minerally?
No. It has no taste. Gelatin, when you buy it at the store, when you buy it online, is very heavily processed. So a good gelatin will have no flavor. It'll be completely neutral. Collagen peptides are a type of collagen, a gelatin that has been processed, and it will dissolve. Now, gelatin, like collagen protein and gelatin itself, will actually thicken. So if you're using it as a supplement, you want to go for collagen peptides. And if you're using it to, say, make a panna cotta, to thicken a sauce, or to add bulk to something else, you're going to go for the collagen protein. So bone broth is naturally rich in gelatin. And so that's why it'll get very, wiggly and gelatinous in the jar, in the fridge.
Yeah. When you put it at not room temperature, but in the fridge, and you can almost like scoop it out with the gelatin. Or if you do a crock pot, I did chicken, like whole chicken in a crock pot, and just left it for 12 hours. Well, of course, I'm not going to eat the whole chicken, so I put it in the fridge, and I get it out, and I can scoop it the next morning, and it's that gelatinous jelly. Totally. You could spread it on toast, drink it with a straw, make a Slurpee. Yeah.
Yeah, people used to use that as aspic. So they would make like a really gelatinous broth, and then they would take, vegetables and shredded meat, and then pour the bone broth over that, stick it in a cool place, and then slice it and serve it on sandwiches. This is what aspic is. It was pretty popular in the 1950s, tomato aspic, and it began to lose popularity in the 1970s. It'd be interesting to see if it makes a comeback with all this interest in bone broth and gelatin.
With the hipster movement, too. That's the next thing they're going to do. They're going to get into traditional foods. They've already brought back neon and windbreakers and Urban Outfitters galore. They're going to get into the whatever that was called, the PB&J sandwich with the bone broth. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so bone broth, the point is very nutritious, easy to do, and you can make it for pennies on the dollar. Probably one of the cheapest things. I mean, and so do you get your bones from the farmer's market? I've seen them go there for like $4 a pound or something really cheap.
Yeah. It's crazy. So when I first started making bone broth and working with traditional foods, this was like 7, 8, 9 years ago. I could go to the farmer's market and they would be free. I'd say, "Oh, do you have any chicken feet for me? Oh, do you have any bones?" And nobody wanted them, so they would just give them away to you. And so now you're seeing them go from anywhere from $2 to $4 a pound, typically, and they're well worth it because they again, there's a lot of protein in there. It's great flavor, and you can add the bone broth to so many different things. So you can use it for braising vegetables, of course, as a base for soups and sauces. And like I like to do is I like to start my morning, especially in the wintertime, with just a cup of broth instead of coffee, and just a cup of broth with a little bit of garlic and parsley. And so it's really versatile, and it can be used for a lot of different things. So you go to the farmer's market, you pick them up there. You can go to Whole Foods will even stock chicken feet and chicken backs and necks. And then, of course, you can absolutely find these items online if you can't find them locally.
Yeah, because I went to the Ballard Farmers Market here in Seattle, and it's really good. I mean, one of the best ones on the West Coast. Huge, humongous, tons of farms come out from Washington, and they sell the bones for, I think it was about $4 a pound or $3 even, and they're just giant beef bones, and you can see like the marrow in it, and it just comes out all gelatinous and whatnot.
Oh, it's so good.
It's great. Anyway, to follow up, the Dave's Killer Bread guy, I looked it up. He was in Washington, 51. He's the co-founder, and he was charged on like assault or something. So he got arrested again, just for the listeners who are worried about that. Yeah. Dave's Killer Bread. Anyway, so we've gone over bread, grains. We've gone over bone broth. Let's talk about fermentation then and the gut. That sounds like a fun one. And I'm really fascinated by it, for sure. I was just on antibiotics from a foot infection I got in Thailand when I was traveling for 2 months. And my whole foot almost fell off, so I had to get on antibiotics. It was kind of like last resort, which, it definitely made me more pro antibiotics, because before you just heard the negative aspects of it, but when you actually see your foot go from like black and blue to normal and pink to completely normal in a matter of 2 weeks, I mean, you're kind of like, hallelujah, modern medicine,
Absolutely. In fact, last year I had to take 2 rounds of antibiotics, and I'm thankful for that because, I mean, they definitely play a role. I think the issue with antibiotics is for a long time they were really overprescribed. I know that when I was little, in elementary school, if I went to the doctor and I had sniffles and a scratchy throat, they would automatically give me antibiotics. They would take the test, they wouldn't wait for the test to come back. I would get a round of antibiotics, and, a week later the test would come back. Maybe I had strep, maybe I didn't. And so I think that really did a lot to destroy just our nation's microbiomes in many ways, because they were just overprescribed. But the thing is that antibiotics, really they're life-saving, and they play a huge role in mitigating infection.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't discount that. But the question is, how do you recover from antibiotic use, or what can we do to build our gut microbiome? It's interesting. My husband and I just had our microbiome sequenced, which was fascinating. It's just really fascinating to see that out there, the different kinds of bacteria and the ratios. But fermented foods are really interesting. They were kind of born of a sense of practicality. Our ancestors were facing these long, hard winters without refrigerations, no trucks to ship, fruits and vegetables across the country. They had to make do with what they had. And so this is where kind of fermentation arose, was a way to make use of all of that summer produce, all of that fall produce, make it last until the next harvest season. And so this is why you see a lot of fermented foods all throughout the world. Cabbage is one ferment that you see everywhere. It's
kimchi, sauerkrauts.
Totally. Curtido. Yeah. You see that it's pretty global, the fermentation of cabbage, as is the fermentation of milk.
Kefir, yogurt.
Exactly. Kefir, yogurt, cheese, butter is traditionally fermented, sour cream, creme fraiche, like it goes on and on and on. There's all these different concoctions. In fact, in Scandinavia, they used to make a wine out of spent whey. I think it was called Blonde. I might be wrong. So historically, we ate a lot more fermented foods than we do now. canning and freezing became popular in the last 200 years or so. And that enabled us to kind of shift away from things like fermented foods as a method of preservation. But the basic thing to ferment something, all you need is something to ferment it in, and time. And I mean TIME, not the herb. And once you have those three things, you can ferment pretty much anything. So sauerkraut is a great one. You take cabbage, you shred it up really, really fine. You sprinkle it with salt. I use about 2 tablespoons of salt for every, I think, 5 pounds of cabbage. And then you knead it together until that cabbage releases its juice. The real important thing, and I know that when people are new to traditional foods and they're new to fermentation, it can be kind of a learning hurdle for them to be able to embrace the prospect of growing bacteria in their food on purpose, right? That's kind of nerve-wracking for a lot of people. So you create this environment where good bacteria, beneficial bacteria, survive and proliferate, and pathogens aren't able to do that because the environment you create is too acidic. So you take your cabbage and your salt and you kind of scrunch it up till it releases its juice, pack it down tightly into a fermentation crock. You can also use a mason jar until that juice that's been mixed with the salt submerges the cabbage. It's really important that anything that you're fermenting remains submerged in its own juice.
Has that little layer about like a quarter inch, half an inch, or
exactly?
Yeah,
like about a half an inch or so.
Can you use water if you don't have enough juice in there?
Absolutely. So for something like cabbage, you want it to create its own juice. But think about true sour pickles, right? They're not going to be shredded, so how are they going to create juice? So what you do is to create a brine of about a tablespoon or so of salt with water, and simply pour it over it. So like sour pickles is about the easiest thing you can make, because you take your pickling cucumbers, you stick them in a jar, and you cover them with salt water, and you seal the jar tightly. And you come back in a couple weeks and you have pickles because those bacteria have eaten up all the carbohydrates in there, and they have produced lactic acid and acetic acid for the vinegar producing.
So I did sauerkraut and kimchi. I do a lot of that, and I noticed one thing. One of the batches came out great, and I did it on my YouTube channel and showed everyone. I just took a big bowl, crushed it up by hand, did the salt, put it in jars, and I left them covered with like a cheesecloth, and it had that like quarter inch to half inch layer of juice, and that turned out great. Almost had this like fizziness to it. But the other batch that I did, exact same time, exact same everything, I used red cabbage for this. May have changed it. Left it for about 3 weeks to a month, and I canned it in like mason jars, but I put the lid on. So one that I really liked had more of a cheesecloth to it. And the other one, not so much. It was like too mushy. It tasted really pickly. Had the jar on it, both in the same container and everything. Do you know what's going on there?
Well, I find it curious that the one with the cheesecloth was the fizzy one, because usually the fizz is created when the carbon dioxide is a natural product of fermentation, and it usually our ferments become fizzy when they're in a sealed jar, and that CO2 has no room to escape, nowhere to go.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to me that the fizzy one was the one with the cheesecloth. So when you're making fermented foods, if it's open to the air like a cheesecloth cover would be, you're not only attracting lactic acid producing bacteria, you're also attracting acetobacter. Okay, these are vinegar producing bacteria. Is that good? People who are fermentation enthusiasts will go on and on about which they think is better and which method they think is better, and this is the only one right way, and that's the only one right way. Honestly, if you like it and it tastes good to you, that's the right way.
Okay.
There's certainly science behind fermentation, but a lot of it is art and personal preference. And so
the downside though to the cheesecloth is, anyone who's ever made kombucha knows, if you even leave it a little bit uncovered, you go there like 3 weeks when you're ready to pull it, and boom. There's living stuff that gets in there and can ruin the whole batch. We're talking maggots and flies and the grossest of the grossest, looks like decomposing animals on the side of the road in your cupboard kind of stuff. It's nasty. So that's the downside of the cheesecloth.
It is totally. So this is why I recommend generally for our fermented vegetables to do it in a sealed environment, because it's much less likely to become contaminated by things like mold, fruit flies, and things like that. So what I use at home is Polish-style fermentation crocks. They're large stoneware crocks, and they have a lid and a well, and you fill the well around them with water, and that creates this anaerobic environment. And that environment prevents things like, the fruit flies and the molds and the stray microbes from contaminating your batch. And I found greater success with that method over time.
Is it the 15-liter one?
That's Polish a really big one. One I would recommend if you're not ready to make 15 liters of sauerkraut.
Yeah, I was about to say. I'm looking on Amazon. It's like $200. That's a lot. You're starting your own business if you buy that one.
That's right. It's an investment. You've got to really like fermentation. Yeah. I recommend actually visiting Mark Campbell on Etsy. Mark Campbell on Etsy. He is a potter, a ceramicist, and I think he works out of Southern California. And he's got beautiful crocks.
California. Whoa, yeah, these are great.
They are really cool, and they're reasonably priced. And the best part is that they are usually in like 1 to 2 quart sizes, so you don't have to make 15 liters of sauerkraut to last your family for like the next 3 years. You can make a quart and see if you like it, and
that's a good. Yeah, these are gorgeous. These look like something straight out of a hippie fest or like a folk life. Like this, this guy definitely has some tapestries in his workshop. Yeah.
Right. They're absolutely stunning, but they're great size. They're a great size, so you can make small batch ferments and that, and it's got the well so that you can create that anaerobic environment. So the two things that I look for when I'm making fermented foods or fermented vegetables is an airtight environment, like the one created in a crock, and then of course I look to make sure that all of those vegetables are submerged in brine. And that creates the environment that really supports the proliferation of lactic acid bacteria. And that's great. And other fermented foods, you've got kombucha, which you want to leave open in the air. Ginger bug wants to be open in the air because you want yeast in there. And you've got Jun tea is another one. It's like kombucha, but it is, so you need a SCOBY. And a SCOBY is a symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast that all work together, right? Only it's made with green tea and honey instead of black tea and sugar. And so it has a very light and delicate flavor. So for people for whom kombucha is too assertive, too vinegary, Jun tea is a really nice alternative for them.
So is honey fructose?
Honey is there's fructose in honey.
Because I heard that because I used coconut sugar once in kombucha and it didn't work at all. It was terrible. And I was talking to someone, I think it was on this show, and we were talking about why that didn't happen, and it was because you can't ferment fructose, they said, or something like that. Maybe that's a myth, or
there's a lot of myths in fermentation. Now, if you're using, a SCOBY is a symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast, right? And so they're all working together in the same environment, and so they become accustomed to that environment, and they do better in that environment. So if you have been feeding them black tea and white sugar or black tea, which is traditionally what is used to make kombucha, they're going to grow accustomed to that. So then to switch them over to something like coconut sugar, you're going to see a degradation in that SCOBY because you've altered their environment. It's like plucking somebody out of New York City and putting them in Kansas and expecting them to operate as they normally would. And that's a cultural shift. And that's what you see with SCOBYs, right? And so Jun tea, so it's not that fructose won't ferment. Any sugar will ferment, like fructose, lactose. They're all fermentable. They will ferment. It's a matter of is that symbiotic culture, colony of bacteria and yeast, is that culture accustomed to the environment that you've put in it, the substrate that you've put it in? Is it accustomed to it? Okay. And so with Jun tea, a lot of people think that honey is antimicrobial. But it's only antimicrobial, in its raw sense. When you mix it with water, that creates an opportunity for beneficial bacteria to do their work. So Jun tea, the SCOBY has been adapted over generations and generations and generations to eat green tea and honey. And that's why it works.
Okay, so fermentation, you got a lot of different avenues to go down. One thing I've never experimented with fermenting-wise, I've done sauerkrauts, kimchis, kombuchas, pickling, canning, all that stuff, but I've never gotten into fermented milk products like dairy or anything like that, and I've never gotten into the fermented grains. Are those easier? Are those harder? Do those use SCOBYs? Like, are those on my level? Because I'm an idiot when it comes to fermentation. I'm terrible. I ruin everything.
So, well, fortunately, there's some things that are really, really easy to do. So yogurt is one that is so easy to do. It's a wonderful thing. So you get your starter, which is a mixture of bacteria and various different types of bacteria, and you mix it into your yogurt. Now, there are two different types. There's thermophilic and mesophilic. Mesophilic yogurts are things like Filia, Filmjölk, a lot of Scandinavian varieties. And the blessed thing about these things is that they culture best at room temperature. So you don't have to worry about temperature control. Yeah. You just take your starter, mix it with milk, leave it on your countertop.
That's pretty good.
And then come back in a day.
Can I use my SCOBY from kombucha to do that? Will it work?
I have never seen that work, but you could certainly see. What you want to do is use actually like a dedicated starter, and that way you know you're getting certain flavors and textures. Cultures for Health, of course, everybody knows that's a great resource for starters. Yeah. Kefir, we've got is a SCOBY. So kefir grains are a SCOBY. They are a mixture of bacteria and yeast. They're little like spongy things that look like cottage cheese. And when you're getting fresh kefir grains, I recommend Kombucha Camp, and you put the grains into the milk, cover them with milk, leave them out for 24 to 48 hours, and you have kefir. Easiest thing you can make.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I've read also that you shouldn't always take the SCOBYs from the friends. Like a friend gives you a SCOBY, you should be really careful because it's very important to get a specific strain of the correct bacteria because you'll be using that for whatever you ferment with. So I've heard also online that you can go to the store and buy one of those really good high quality like GT kombuchas for $4 or $5. And pour it in a starting batch and actually make your own SCOBY from that.
That's true. If you get a really high quality raw kombucha from the store, you can often make a SCOBY with it. The challenge with that is that they're typically very small and flimsy. So I find that it's just worth it to go and spend the $30 for a high quality kombucha SCOBY. I use my kombucha SCOBYs come from Kombucha Camp. They're like this thick. They're nice and thick. They're reliable. And the problem with getting them from friends is often people in the past have been using, throughout that culture's history, may have mixed it with vinegar or something like that. And so there have been cases where people's kombucha has been contaminated with vinegar eels. They're a small nematode, which is essentially a worm. The worm doesn't affect your or my health. It only affects the health of the SCOBY. And so it will eat up the SCOBY over time and cause it to no longer produce kombucha. It doesn't affect our health.
Eel worm? It's
called a vinegar worm.
Oh, yeah, I don't want that.
You don't want that. And so that's why I recommend you really find, I think it's worth it for my part to purchase from a good quality source.
Yeah. Okay, so switching gears a little bit, going to your blog, The Nourished Kitchen. I know you have a book under the same title. Yes. I'm curious, you have 500,000 Facebook users, probably pretty popular traffic base on your blog. What's been like the most trafficked post? Like what's your popular best hitter?
Absolutely. My bone broth post, it's just nourishedkitchen.com/bone broth bone broth post gets the most traffic day in, day out. Absolutely. If you Google bone broth, it's usually one of the first few that pop up, and that has consistently been the case. Sauerkraut, homemade sauerkraut, gets a ton of traffic, and that's just native from search engines, right?
Yeah.
But what I find
you're number one. I just Googled it. It's bone broth right here. Look at that. You're number one on Google.
Right.
Put that on a plaque.
There we go. But in terms of posts that are really popular with people, I've got a homemade root beer post, and that looks at root beer, which is this beautiful traditional American food. but how it was originally made. And it was originally made with a lot of foraged herbs, foraged roots, real sassafras, sarsaparilla, juniper berries, hops, and all of this goodness. And it was fermented. It was a fermented drink. A lot of our sodas were traditionally fermented drinks before we began to add, sugars and high fructose corn syrup and carbonation to them.
I just pulled that
so
one
they
up.
got their
I'm trying that one. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. The homemade root beer is it's very different from modern root beer. It's got bitter notes. It's more like a medicinal beer. But it's a really cool one, and that always, people always tend to like that in terms of virality.
Not number one on Google, but it's getting there. Oh man. So tell me a little bit about your book. What inspired you to write it? What's it about? What can the listener at home expect if they pick it up?
My book is called The Nourished Kitchen, named after the blog. And what I love, what I wanted to do when I wrote that book was to be able to expand the breadth of knowledge about traditional foods and to really explore that. So in Nourished Kitchen, and as a blogger, most of what I write is in 300 to 700 word snippets, and it has to tell the whole story, and that's very, very limiting. But in a book, you have the opportunity to really flesh things out and explain the ins and outs of fermentation in much greater depth, or the ins and outs of broth making, or why it's important to choose heirloom vegetables. You can do all of this in much greater depth. And so it's a whole piece. As opposed to individual snippets. And that was really exciting for me from an artistic perspective. Right. And for the reader who looks into it, it gives a lot of information on farm-to-table cooking, on connecting with local farmers, and most importantly, it gives you a lot of information on traditional foods preparations. So sourdough, taking it from just a slurry of bread and flour and water into something that is, really extraordinary, like artisanal style breads, bone broths, lots of fermented dairy, and most of the recipes contain lots of vegetables and lots of pastured meats and things like that.
Okay, so some new stuff if we're bored of the same old kind of low carb, high quality, whatever protein book. Your stuff might have a little experimentation that the listener can do at home that they haven't tried before.
Lots of experimentation. You'll be able to learn how to use all the stuff you see in your CSIA box or your farmer's market. And it's really an exploration of traditional foods. And it's organized not by appetizer or dessert or anything like that. Rather, it's organized on based on where your food comes from.
Okay.
So it really takes you back to the farm and shows you the whole process of how food is grown with intention, prepared with intention, and then enjoyed with intention.
So you have a lot of recipes, you have a lot of knowledge about fermented foods and traditional eating. What are kind of maybe one or two resources that you follow or listen to?
I love to follow, Mommypotamus is one of my favorites for people who follow Natural Family Living blog. She's a great blog. I really enjoy, for a culinary perspective, Food 52. I really like to pay attention. Nom Nom Paleo. I mean, who does not love Michelle? She's wonderful. So those are great resources. And I think that Cooks Illustrated is a great resource just for becoming a better cook.
Okay, great. Well, Jennifer, The Nourished Kitchen, is that thenourished.kitchen.com?
Yes, it's nourishedkitchen.com.
That's the best place to find you?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome, Jennifer. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much, Clark.